He laughed in the middle of the courtroom, thinking I was just a trembling ex-wife clutching a cheap folder. He assumed I lacked the money for an attorney, so I naturally lacked the brains for his game. But women like me do not walk into court with wealth. We arrive with memories, ledgers, and the exact truths that kept his empire standing. Before that single morning ended, he would finally learn I needed no one to speak for me. My name is Zoe Cooper. I am 44 years old, and I live in the manicured, quiet suburbs of Franklin, Tennessee. If you passed me in the aisles of the local grocery store, you probably would not look twice. I am exactly the kind of woman society trains you to look right past. A woman wearing practical shoes, carrying a canvas tote bag, quietly making sure the world around her does not collapse. But that is the thing about invisible women. We are the ones who keep the engine running while everyone else admires the paint job. My husband, Grant Cooper, loves the paint job. He is the founder and the very loud, very visible face of Cooper Ridge Development. It is a commercial landscaping and development firm, a name chosen specifically because it sounds far larger and more established than its actual substance. Grant is a master of projection. When he steps in front of a crowd, a local zoning board, or a potential client, he embodies the quintessential sharp American businessman. His suits are always perfectly tailored, hugging his shoulders just right, made from fabrics that look expensive even from across a crowded room. He has a smile deployed with absolute precision, and a booming, confident voice that fills any space he occupies. He possesses an uncanny ability to make everyone he speaks to believe that he, alone, built his empire out of the Tennessee dirt with his bare hands. He talks about vision, about growth, about transforming spaces, and people hang on his every word, but the dirt rarely touches his fingernails. The reality of Cooper Ridge Development lives inside our house, specifically at the kitchen island, which I transformed into a command center over a decade ago. While Grant is out shaking hands on the golf course or having a bourbon at the country club with local politicians, I am the one answering the frantic phone calls from our soil and gravel vendors. I am the one drafting and processing the endless stream of subcontractor agreements, making sure the plumbers and electricians are locked into watertight schedules. It is my job to track the complex web of building permits across multiple counties, to make sure the insurance certificates are fully up to date, so we do not face crippling liability on a job site, and to run the weekly payroll so the men actually digging the trenches can feed their families on Friday afternoons. I handle all the minor, tedious disputes and vendor complaints, the things Grant lazily waves away with his hand and calls trivial little nonsense. I do all of this without an official title in the corporate registry. My name is nowhere on the frosted glass doors of his downtown office. I do not draw a formal salary, nor do I have a designated desk. Yet, nearly every single internal process, every dollar routed to its proper place, passes directly through my fingertips. I remember the mornings, rising at 5 o'clock, long before the sun peeked over the rolling hills of Williamson County. I would sit with my black coffee, sorting through faded receipts and crumpled invoices that Grant had tossed into his truck console. I smoothed them out, categorized them by project code, and entered them into the accounting software. I was the silent partner he never had to pay. It is a strange existence, being the structural beam of a house while everyone compliments the wallpaper. You get used to the weight. You even convince yourself that bearing the heavy load is just a practical form of love. We have a daughter, Maddie. She is a brilliant, beautiful young woman, currently navigating her way through a rigorous graduate program up in Nashville. I love her with a fierce, protective devotion, and I know she loves me just as much. But for her entire 22 years of life, I have protected the myth of her father. Maddie grew up believing that Grant is the sole provider, the sturdy, infallible pillar holding up our comfortable suburban life. She sees him writing the tuition checks at the start of every semester, completely unaware that I had to meticulously shuffle funds from 3 different operational accounts just to ensure those checks did not bounce. She sees his pride when he talks about his business, and she assumes I am simply along for the ride. I let her believe the illusion because I thought that was what a good mother did. I wanted to preserve the family narrative. I never wanted her to view our foundation as fragile, or her father as anything less than a hero, because our foundation was incredibly fragile. The decay of our marriage did not happen in a sudden explosive scandal. There were no dramatic screaming matches on the front lawn for the neighbors to witness. No broken dishes scattered across the hardwood floors in the middle of the night. Instead, it eroded in absolute silence. It wore down through 1,000 tiny, unacknowledged cuts over the span of 20 years. It was the dinners that sat growing cold on the stove, while he stayed late at networking events he never invited me to. It was the vacant, glazed-over stares when I tried to tell him about my day or share a thought that did not directly involve his comfort. It was the casual, offhand remarks designed, whether consciously or not, to make me feel small, contained, and inconsequential. Grant developed a particularly cruel habit over the years. Whenever we hosted a summer barbecue on our sprawling back patio, surrounded by other local business owners and their wives, the conversation would inevitably turn to the local economy, property values, or corporate growth. Grant would wait for the right moment, wrap his arm around my shoulder, squeeze it in a way that looked perfectly affectionate to the untrained eye, and chuckle. He would tell his friends that his Zoe is a sweetheart, a wonderful mother, but she is simply not suited for big money talk. He would paint me as a simple domestic creature, someone who gets flustered by anything more complicated than a weekly grocery budget or a school bake sale. The guests would laugh good-naturedly, and I would force a polite smile, sipping my white wine, swallowing the burning lump in my throat. Those guests did not know the truth. They did not know that just 12 hours prior, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was the one sitting in the dark, frantically trying to untangle a massive accounting disaster Grant had created. He had double-billed a major corporate client for $50,000, a reckless mistake that could have cost us our biggest commercial landscaping contract of the year. I found the error while he slept soundly upstairs. I corrected the ledger, balanced the books, drafted a smooth professional apology email under his name, and essentially saved his professional reputation. Yet, in the sunlight, surrounded by his peers, holding his expensive craft beer, I was deemed entirely incapable of understanding high finance. He needed me to be small so he could appear large. I swallowed the humiliation over and over again because I thought it was the required price for keeping the peace. I justified his arrogance by telling myself he was under immense pressure running a company. I rationalized his dismissive behavior as the unfortunate but natural byproduct of his ambition. When a woman spends 2 decades making excuses for a man, it becomes a deeply ingrained reflex. You stop seeing the disrespect as a weapon aimed at your chest. You just see it as the weather. You learn to carry an umbrella, put on a thick coat, and keep your head down to survive the storm. I tell you all of this, not to ask for sympathy. Sympathy is useless when you are fighting for your survival. I tell you this because it is vital to understand the silent, invisible battlefield before the very first shot is fired. At this point in my life, standing in my pristine kitchen wiping down the marble countertops on a Tuesday afternoon, I had absolutely no idea that a massive legal war was looming just over the horizon. I did not know that my entire existence, my quiet sacrifices, and my hidden labor were about to be dragged into the harsh, fluorescent lighting of a county courtroom. But looking back now, the ending was already written in those quiet, resentful years. Grant made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He believed that because I was silent, I was blind. He believed his own flawless marketing. He genuinely thought that because he stood at the podium, he was the only one who knew how the building was constructed. But here is the undeniable truth about human nature, a truth he would soon learn the hard way. The person who is underestimated the most, the person forced to stand in the shadows, quietly cleaning up the messes and balancing the books, is always the person who sees absolutely everything. The collapse did not begin with a stray text message or the lingering scent of an unfamiliar perfume on a shirt collar. It began, as most true disasters do, with the numbers. It was the 3rd week of October, The air outside was turning crisp, and I was sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by my usual fortress of manila folders, bank statements, and vendor invoices. I was preparing the third quarter financial reports to send over to our external certified public accountant. This was a tedious, solitary ritual I had executed 4 times a year for nearly 2 decades. My job was to ensure every single penny matched, every expense was properly categorized, and every receipt was accounted for before the official tax professionals looked at our books. I was deep into reconciling the operating account for August when my finger stopped moving down the printed ledger. There was a fuel charge, $850 at a commercial diesel station out on Highway 96. I checked the date. It was a Sunday in late August. I remembered that specific weekend perfectly because a massive, unseasonal storm had rolled through the county, flooding the lower roads. Every single Cooper Ridge development truck and trailer had been securely locked behind the chain-link fence of our equipment lot from Friday evening until Monday morning. No crew had been dispatched. No vehicles had moved. Yet, someone had pumped nearly $1,000 of diesel fuel on the company card. I frowned, making a small pencil mark next to the line item. I assumed Grant had simply handed the card to one of the foremen for a personal favor, a sloppy boundary issue he was notorious for. But 2 pages later, another inconsistency glared up at me. It was a heavy machinery rental fee. $4,200 paid to a regional equipment leasing company for an excavator. I flipped through the project logs. The job code attached to the rental was blank. I cross-referenced the active sites for that specific 2-week period. We were finishing a massive corporate park in Brentwood, but that phase of the project only required light planting, mulch distribution, and irrigation installation. There was absolutely no earth moving required, and certainly no need for a massive, commercial-grade excavator. Then came the charge that made my stomach tighten. It was categorized loosely under client retention and entertainment, $2,900 at a luxury boutique hotel in downtown Nashville. Grant entertained clients frequently. Yes. He bought expensive bourbon, paid for premium golf course fees, and hosted dinners at high-end steakhouses. But he did not book weekend spa packages and luxury suites to woo local commercial real estate developers. Initially, my muscle memory took over. I took a deep breath and chalked it up to his chronic administrative carelessness. For years, I had been the human broom sweeping up behind his chaotic financial parade. He would sign contracts without reading the payment terms, approve invoices twice, or use the corporate debit card for a personal dinner because he forgot his own wallet. My entire role was to catch these errors, reclassify the funds, adjust the owner equity line, and make the mess disappear before the accountant saw it. I figured this quarter was just a particularly bad display of his usual sloppiness. I decided to dig into the raw data to find the missing puzzle pieces so I could fix them. But the deeper I dug into the digital archives, the more the ground beneath me began to give way. I started pulling the raw bank feeds and matching them against our internal project milestones. A chilling rhythm began to emerge from the spreadsheet rows. These phantom expenses were not random errors scattered throughout the year. They followed a highly specific, deliberate pattern. They almost always appeared precisely 3 to 5 days after Cooper Ridge received a massive, 6-figure milestone payment from a major commercial client. A $200,000 deposit would clear the bank, and almost immediately, a vaguely labeled consulting fee, a phantom equipment lease, or an obscure material purchase would quietly siphon off a percentage of that cash. The descriptions were always just generic enough to pass a casual glance. Site assessment, field logistics, vendor staging. They were perfectly designed to avoid the scrutiny of anyone who did not know the day-to-day physical operations of the company. But I knew the operations. I knew every piece of gravel delivered and every hour billed. I walked over to the supply drawer and pulled out 2 highlighters. I set my usual pencil down. I uncapped the green marker and the red marker. Green was for verified, legitimate expenses backed by a physical work order or a known vendor. Red was for the ghosts. I started from the beginning of the third quarter and worked my way backward. At first, there were just a few red streaks scattered among the green. But as I pulled the records for the second quarter, and then the first, my hand grew steady and cold. The red ink began to bleed across the pages. By the end of a grueling, sleepless 7-day review, the red lines vastly outnumbered the green ones. The company was bleeding out, and the wounds were surgical. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning. Grant was standing by the coffee maker, dressed in a sharp navy suit, casually scrolling through his phone. I walked into the kitchen carrying the printed ledger for May. I laid it on the granite island, right next to his mug. I pointed to a specific wire transfer. It was a staggering $38,000 sent to an entity called Field Solutions. "Grant," I said, my voice remarkably level, "I need the vendor file for this. I cannot reconcile the May accounts. We do not have any physical inventory, shipping receipts, or service logs from a company by this name." He barely glanced at the paper. He did not ask to see the context. He did not offer to call the office manager. He took a sip of his coffee, sighed heavily, and looked at me with an expression of profound, exhausted irritation. "It is high-level business. Zoe," he said, waving his hand dismissively in the exact way he did when turning away a panhandler on the street. "It is strategic tax positioning. You would not understand the mechanics of it. Just code it to general overhead and leave it alone." He picked up his briefcase and walked out the door, leaving the silence ringing in my ears. That sentence did not break my heart. It did not make me want to cry. Instead, it stripped away the final layer of fog from my brain. For 20 years, whenever Grant made a mistake, he would at least try to stumble through a half-hearted explanation. He would invent a story, blame a subcontractor, or feign ignorance. But in that moment, looking at the $38,000 ghost, he had not even bothered to try. He did not care that the numbers made no sense. He simply assumed his authority was absolute. He did not want to explain himself. He just wanted me to shut up and obey. The tectonic plates of my reality shifted. He was not protecting the company from taxes. He was hiding money. And he was using the very accounting system I maintained to do it. That afternoon, I drove to the local office supply store and purchased a heavy-duty portable scanner and 3 massive external hard drives. I paid in cash. I returned to the empty house, locked the front door, and set up a workstation at the dining room table. I began to systematically and legally duplicate the entire financial history of Cooper Ridge Development. I did not steal anything. I simply copied the documents I already managed every single day. I scanned the altered invoices, the bank statements with the red highlights, the fraudulent timesheets, and the vendor payment logs that I had meticulously created myself. I archived the email chains where I had repeatedly asked him for clarification on missing receipts, and his brief, dismissive replies instructing me to just push it through. I built a digital fortress of irrefutable, chronological proof. The sun went down, and the house grew completely still. I did not stop. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen was bathed in the harsh, bright glow of the overhead recessed lights. The soft hum of the scanner was the only sound in the room. I sat at the island, looking down at the neat, towering stacks of paper and the blinking light of the hard drive. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of calm wash over me. The woman who had spent 2 decades desperately trying to hold together the fragile pieces of a dying marriage was entirely gone. Sitting in her place under the bright lights was someone entirely new. I had stopped being a wife, and I had started becoming the most dangerous, well-documented witness against the man sleeping upstairs. Her name was Sienna Vale. She was 31 years old, armed with a degree in digital marketing and a manufactured aura of corporate sophistication. Grant had hired her under the guise of an independent freelance contract, officially bringing her on board to serve as a brand specialist. His stated goal, repeated endlessly during board meetings and vendor calls, was to completely refresh the company image and capture a younger, more lucrative demographic of commercial developers. I did not stumble upon this betrayal through the explosive, dramatic avenues you see in movies. There was no secret burner phone accidentally left unlocked on the nightstand. I did not find a lipstick stain smeared aggressively across his shirt collar. Nor did an anonymous friend pull me aside in a grocery store aisle to whisper rumors. The reality of my humiliation was much quieter, seeping into my life through a slow, steady drip of foreign details. The first undeniable clue was the scent. Grant drove a heavy-duty pickup truck, a utilitarian vehicle that had always smelled predictably of worn leather, black coffee, and the faint, dusty residue of construction sites. But one crisp Tuesday morning, when I opened the driver's side door to move the truck out of the driveway, I was hit by an invisible wall of perfume. It was a complex, expensive fragrance, heavy notes of bergamot layered over a deep, cloying vanilla. It clung to the fabric of the passenger seat and lingered in the air vents. It was a scent that demanded attention, lingering like an arrogant guest who refused to leave the room. Then came the physical paper trails that slipped through the cracks of his otherwise careful digital manipulation. While sorting his dry cleaning, I found crumpled dinner receipts shoved deep into the pockets of his suit trousers. These were not the massive, fraudulent wire transfers I had already uncovered. These were intimate, personal indulgences, brazenly paid for with the corporate credit card and lazily coded under client entertainment. There was a bill for $280 at an intimate, dimly lit French bistro on a Wednesday evening, a tab for $150 spent on craft cocktails at a rooftop lounge on a Thursday afternoon. The pattern was undeniably romantic, not professional. Before long, the invasion breached the walls of the office and the confines of his truck. Sienna began to leave physical breadcrumbs of her existence directly inside my home, a territorial marking disguised as casual carelessness. It was the audacity of these small, intimate objects that bruised the most. I found a matte pink ceramic coffee cup sitting innocuously in our dishwasher, a piece of pottery that stood out violently against the matching white porcelain sets we had owned for a decade. A heavy artisanal candle smelling of that exact same bergamot and vanilla suddenly appeared on the entryway console table, completely replacing the unscented pillars I had carefully chosen. One afternoon, while gathering laundry from the bedroom floor, I pulled a hand-rolled silk handkerchief from the pocket of Grant's light spring jacket. I did not buy it. Grant did not possess the refined taste to buy something like that for himself. The true, devastating nature of my replacement crystallized on a Thursday at roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I had returned home unusually early from a routine dental appointment. The house was dead quiet, bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the front door and walked softly down the hallway toward the kitchen. There she was. Sienna Vale was standing right in the center of my kitchen. She wore wide-leg linen trousers and a silk blouse, looking completely and utterly at ease, as if she were waiting for a pot of water to boil in her own private sanctuary. She was casually trimming the stems of white lilies with my kitchen shears, arranging them methodically into a tall glass vase on my stone counter. She did not drop the shears when I walked into the room. She did not gasp, flush with embarrassment, or scramble to invent an excuse for why she was alone in my house. Instead, she slowly looked up, met my eyes directly, and offered a soft, unnervingly polite smile. It was the exact kind of practiced, gracious smile a homeowner gives a temporary hired helper. It held absolutely no shame, no guilt, and no fear of being caught. It was the serene expression of a young woman who firmly believed that the legal wife standing before her was merely a relic, an outdated, dusty fixture that was already scheduled for demolition. Before I could even command my vocal cords to demand she leave, Grant walked in through the sliding glass doors from the back patio. He was holding his phone, looking deeply engrossed in a text message. He stopped when he saw me standing there, but the frantic panic I expected to see in a cheating husband's eyes was entirely absent. He looked mildly inconvenienced, perhaps slightly annoyed by the scheduling overlap. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the desperate apologies or the frantic lies to spill from his mouth. Grant did not apologize. He simply slipped his phone into his pocket and sighed. "Sienna is doing a stylistic walkthrough of the property," Grant said, his tone flat, authoritative, and heavily patronizing. "We are hosting the regional development mixer here next month. She is helping me reposition the brand for the event. We need the house to reflect the modern direction of the company, and the current decor is lacking." He looked at me then, his gaze raking over my practical wool sweater and my comfortable flat shoes. His eyes held absolutely no warmth, no history, and no affection, only a cold, evaluating judgment. He looked at me as if I were too provincial, too hopelessly anchored in the past to possibly comprehend the modern corporate era he was stepping into. That was the exact moment the earth shifted on its axis beneath my feet. The cruelty of the situation was no longer just about the physical affair. It was the open, brazen disrespect of it all. This woman had not sneaked into my home like a thief in the night. She had walked boldly through the front door because my husband had willingly held it open for her. Grant had already begun rewriting the narrative of our lives in his own mind. In his shiny new story, Sienna was the sophisticated partner perfectly suited for his elevated status, and I was merely a temporary, stubborn obstacle he had to maneuver around until the legal paperwork could be quietly filed. I did not scream. I did not throw the vase of lilies against the wall. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen without speaking a single word to either of them. I went straight to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, closing the door quietly but firmly behind me. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feeling a heavy, suffocating pressure building in the center of my chest. My hands were shaking violently, not from sorrow, but from a profound, terrifying surge of adrenaline. Right at that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller ID flashed. It was Maddie. I stared at the glowing screen, listening to the vibration against my leg. For 22 years, my maternal instinct had been to shield her from every ugly truth. My absolute reflex was to swallow my tears, clear my throat, and chirp brightly into the receiver that everything was perfectly fine, that her father was just stressed from working hard, and that our family was safe. I answered the call. "Hey, Mom," Maddie said, her voice bright and echoing slightly, likely walking across the university campus between her afternoon classes. "I just wanted to check in. How is everything going at home?" My throat closed up instantly. The burning sensation behind my eyes was intense, but I blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. I thought about the white lilies sitting on my stone counter. I thought about the man who had just looked at me like I was a piece of obsolete machinery ready for the scrapyard. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I did not give her my usual cheerful lie. "Mom," she asked, her tone immediately shifting to genuine concern. "Are you there? Is everything okay?" "Maddie," I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly steady whisper. "I think someone is spending our family's money as if I would never look closely." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the protective glass house I had built around her childhood, finally cracking down the middle. When I finally hung up the phone a few minutes later, the shaking in my hands had completely stopped. The emotional transition within me was absolute and irreversible. I realized sitting in that quiet guest room that my heart was not actually broken over the loss of Grant's romantic affection. That affection had withered away into nothingness years ago. What truly caused me agony, what fueled the icy, focused fire now burning steadily in my veins, was the profound insult of his assumption. He did not just betray my vows. He looked at me, looked at everything I had tirelessly built and maintained for him, and simply assumed I was too ignorant to notice, too weak to fight, and too complacent to do anything but remain silent forever. I could no longer trust the internet connection inside my own home. If Grant possessed the calculating foresight to siphon massive sums of money right under my nose, it was entirely within the realm of possibility that he had installed monitoring software on our shared wireless router. I needed a completely sterile, untraceable digital environment. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, I waited for Grant's truck to disappear around the bend of our suburban street. I packed my canvas tote bag, locked the front door, and drove toward the historic district. I parked my car 3 blocks away from the Franklin Public Library, feeding a handful of silver coins into an old street meter just to avoid leaving a digital credit card trail for parking. The air inside the library was cool, heavily conditioned, and smelled faintly of floor wax and aging paper. It was a sanctuary of absolute quiet. I walked past the children's section and the rows of contemporary fiction, making my way to a secluded desktop terminal tucked away in the back corner of the reference department. I pulled out the hard wooden chair, sat down, slipped my reading glasses onto the bridge of my nose, and opened a blank, private browser window. The secret to unraveling a man like Grant is understanding the architecture of his ego. He is not a criminal mastermind operating in the shadows. He is an arrogant opportunist who loves the spotlight. I knew he would not hide his stolen wealth in an obscure offshore account or bury it in complex cryptocurrency wallets. He would want his new assets close, tangible, and ready to be shown off the moment the divorce papers were finalized. I navigated to the Tennessee Secretary of State online business registry. My hands were remarkably steady as I began to cross-reference the exact dates surrounding the massive, fraudulent wire transfers I had archived back at the house. I filtered the database for newly formed limited liability companies within the state over the last 12 months. For 2 agonizing hours, I scrolled through endless mind-numbing lists of generic construction ventures, restaurant groups, and real estate holding companies. My eyes burned from the harsh glare of the public monitor. I was looking for a pattern, a familiar registered agent, or an address that triggered a memory. Then, a single name jumped off the glowing screen and wrapped its cold, invisible hands tightly around my throat. Vail Harbor Holdings. Vail. Sienna's last name. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the name forced a sharp breath out of my lungs. He did not even try to be clever. He was so confident in my blindness that he had named his secret financial vessel after his mistress. I clicked on the public filing documents. The company had been officially incorporated a mere 4 months prior. The registration forms did not list Grant Cooper as the owner or managing member. Instead, the entity was registered through a generic, faceless commercial registered agent service designed specifically to shield the identities of the true owners. However, the physical mailing address attached to the primary operating documents was not a sterile post office box. It was a very specific townhouse located in a trendy, newly developed neighborhood in downtown Nashville. I closed my eyes, accessing the massive mental filing cabinet I had painstakingly built over the last 2 decades. I knew that address. I had seen that exact street and unit number on a corporate lodging invoice 6 months ago. At the time, I had questioned the expense. Grant had smoothly claimed it was a short-term rental secured for an out-of-state architectural consultant we were hoping to poach. I had believed him. But it was never a consultant's temporary office. It was the physical birthplace of his hidden empire, a love nest funded directly by the sweat of the company I helped run. My fingers flew across the sticky plastic keyboard of the library terminal. I abandoned the state registry and pulled up the county property tax databases. If an entity named Vail Harbor Holdings existed, it needed to hold something of value. I typed the limited liability company's name into the property ownership search bar. The query processed for 3 seconds before returning a single, massive result. The company had recently purchased a prime, highly coveted piece of lakefront real estate in a neighboring county. I pulled up the parcel map. The lot included a partially renovated, industrial-style warehouse. It was the exact kind of rustic, high-end commercial space that was currently commanding premium rent across the state, perfectly suited to be transformed into a boutique firm's headquarters. I looked at the recorded closing date on the property deed. It was the 22nd of June. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a folded piece of lined notebook paper, quickly scanning my own handwritten notes from the late-night kitchen sessions. The massive, inexplicable $38,000 wire transfer to the fake vendor had cleared our operating account on the 20th of June. 3 other subsequent, vaguely labeled transactions, split systematically into smaller chunks of $15,000, $10,000, and $12,000 to avoid triggering banking alerts, had bled out of our accounts over the following 8 weeks. The math was absolute. The timeline was completely flawless. Grant had used the legitimate, hard-earned revenue of Cooper Ridge Development to buy a secret waterfront property with the woman he planned to replace me with. My heart hammered a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I was not just finding scattered breadcrumbs anymore, I was unearthing the entire bakery. But the final piece of the puzzle, the devastating detail that transformed my quiet, heartbroken investigation into a matter of absolute, primal survival, was buried deep within the municipal zoning portal. Because the newly purchased lakefront warehouse was partially renovated, the new owners were legally required to submit a structural continuation permit to the City Planning Commission to resume construction. I accessed the public permit files, scrolling down to the bottom of the digital application to see who had verified the structural blueprints. The screen blurred for a fraction of a second. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh fluorescent light reflecting off the lenses of my glasses. There was a digital signature stamped at the very bottom of the compliance form. It was not Grant's electronic signature. It certainly was not Sienna's. It was a unique string of alphanumeric characters representing a highly specific internal administrative profile. It was my profile. It was the exact digital credential I had created 7 years ago to expedite routine city planning approvals and maneuver through municipal red tape on behalf of Cooper Ridge. Grant had the master access to the password vault, but everyone at the local zoning office knew that when that specific credential was utilized, it was Zoe Cooper confirming the technical data. He had not just stolen the money. He had meticulously logged into the municipal database, intentionally bypassed his own executive credentials, and weaponized the very system I had built to sign off on a property he was actively hiding from me. He had left a digital paper trail pointing directly at my desk. A sudden, freezing wave of absolute clarity washed over my entire body. I sat back in the hard wooden library chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen as the library patrons whispered quietly around me. This was no longer a simple, tragic case of a cheating husband hiding a few liquid assets before dropping a divorce petition. Grant was actively constructing a massive legal firewall to protect his new life, and he had intentionally built it directly on top of my shoulders. If the Internal Revenue Service ever audited Cooper Ridge development, or if the fraudulent wire transfers were somehow flagged by a state banking regulator, the digital documentation for the hidden waterfront property would not lead back to his immaculate office. It would point a bright, flashing red arrow directly at the company's silent, uncredited, uneducated bookkeeper. Me. He had set me up as the perfect, disposable scapegoat. A weaker woman might have panicked right there in the reference section. A different kind of wife might have run out of the library, driven her car straight to his downtown office, burst through the frosted glass doors, and screamed until her lungs gave out. But the woman I was rapidly becoming did not have the luxury of hysterics. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who still harbor the foolish belief that someone is coming to rescue them. I knew with terrifying certainty that no one was coming. I reached into the depths of my tote bag and pulled out a brand new, thick, wire-bound notebook. It had a solid black cover, completely unmarked. I opened it to the very first crisp, perfectly lined page. I took a black ink pen from my purse and began to write. I did not write about my broken heart or my shattered marriage. I wrote down the exact time of day. I wrote down the 9-digit transaction codes. I recorded the parcel identification number for the lakefront land. I meticulously documented the specific dates, the bank routing numbers, the registered agent details, and the undeniable structural links between the legitimate operations of our family business and the parasitic shell of his new enterprise. I drew a straight, dark line connecting the missing $38,000 to the warehouse deed. I drew another sharp line connecting my hijacked digital signature to his grand, cowardly escape plan. I was no longer just a spectator watching my life fall apart. I was weaving every single isolated crumb into a highly concentrated explosive device. For 20 years, Grant had effortlessly controlled the narrative. He was the charming, visionary architect of our lives, and I was just the quiet, invisible mortar holding his bricks together. But as I closed the heavy black notebook and slid it carefully back into my bag, the power dynamic in our marriage permanently and irrevocably fractured. He genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted me. He believed he was going to walk away with the money, the younger woman, the waterfront property, and a spotless professional reputation. leaving me to potentially shoulder the devastating legal fallout of his financial crimes. He was entirely wrong, because now I understood the brutal rules of the war he had secretly declared. If I did not strike first, and strike with absolute devastating precision, he was not just planning to rob me of my marital assets. He was perfectly willing to let me take the fall for his sins. He was ready to let me burn. The drive down the interstate toward Murfreesboro took exactly 45 minutes. I did not have the confidence, nor did I have the liquid cash, to walk into one of those towering, glass-fronted law firms in downtown Nashville. Grant had always controlled our primary checking accounts. I knew that if I suddenly withdrew a $10,000 retainer fee, he would immediately receive a digital alert on his phone. He would know I was arming myself before I even had a chance to load the weapon. Instead, I parked my sedan in the cracked asphalt lot of a single-story brick building that housed a civil legal aid center. It was a modest, overworked facility, the kind of place that smelled permanently of stale coffee and old carpet. I sat in the waiting room, holding a thick, heavy canvas bag containing my black notebook and 3 neatly organized binders of printed evidence. After waiting for nearly 2 hours, a receptionist called my name. I was ushered into a small, cramped office. Behind a remarkably cluttered desk sat Avery Sloan. Avery was a seasoned attorney in her late 50s. She did not wear a designer suit or a forced, predatory smile. She wore a sensible gray cardigan, her graying hair pulled back into a severe clasp. She operated on a limited-scope consulting basis, specifically dedicating a portion of her practice to assisting women navigating complex asset disputes during divorce when they lacked immediate access to marital funds. I sat down across from her. My hands were trembling slightly as I pulled the heavy binders from my bag and laid them onto the small patch of clear space on her desk. I expected her to offer me a sympathetic smile, a box of tissues, or one of those hollow, comforting platitudes people always give you when your life is falling apart. I braced myself for her to tell me that everything would be all right. Avery Sloan did not do any of that. She did not offer me a tissue. She simply put on her reading glasses, opened the first binder, and started reading. For 30 minutes, the only sound in the cramped office was the crisp turning of pages and the heavy ticking of a wall clock. I sat in absolute silence, watching her eyes scan the spreadsheets, the highlighted bank statements, and the intricate diagrams I had drawn in my black notebook connecting our legitimate business to the fraudulent holding company. Finally, Avery leaned back in her chair. She took off her glasses and looked directly into my eyes. "Who processes the weekly payroll for the landscaping crews?" Avery asked, her voice raspy and entirely devoid of emotion. "I do," I replied quietly. "Who reconciles the accounts receivable at the end of every month?" she pressed, tapping a finger against a stack of invoices. "Who follows up when a commercial contractor is 60 days late on a payment?" "I do," I said, sitting up slightly straighter in my chair. "And the liability insurance certificates?" she asked, flipping to the section where I had documented the fake equipment rentals. "Who tracks the expiration dates to ensure your heavy machinery operators are legally covered on municipal job sites?" "That is my responsibility," I answered, my voice growing firmer. "It has been my responsibility for nearly 2 decades." Avery folded her hands on top of the open binder. She did not look at me with pity. She looked at me with a profound, piercing respect. "Zoe," Avery said, her tone absolute and unwavering, "the only person in the world who understands the true structure of this business is you." Hearing those words spoken aloud by a legal professional was a physical sensation. It felt as though a massive, suffocating weight had been instantly lifted off my chest. For 20 years, I had been told by the man I married that I was merely a helper, a background character, a woman entirely unsuited for the complexities of high-level commerce. But sitting in that cramped, dusty office, the ground beneath my feet finally solidified. I was not crazy. I was not stupid. I was the architect of the very foundation my husband was currently standing on. Avery leaned forward, her demeanor shifting from investigative to tactical. She explained the brutal reality of our situation. Because my budget was severely restricted, tied up entirely in accounts Grant monitored. Avery could not officially take me on for full, comprehensive representation right at that moment. However, she could act as my consulting attorney. She could teach me exactly how to fight. "You do not possess a formal degree in accounting," Avery explained, tapping her pen against the desk. "You do not have a law degree. But the court does not require you to hold a master's degree to prove a mathematical fact. The meticulous paper trail you have constructed here is more than enough to force a judge to mandate a comprehensive review of his financial disclosures. We can use this to compel an independent business valuation and hold him legally accountable for his fiduciary duties to the marital estate." Over the next 2 hours, the legal aid office transformed into a classroom. Avery did not just give me advice, she fundamentally rewired the way my brain processed my own life. She helped me draft formal requests for document production, known in the legal world as discovery. She taught me how to categorize my lists of financial discrepancies so they aligned with state statutes regarding hidden marital assets. More importantly, Avery taught me how to strip the emotion out of my narrative. When a woman is betrayed, her first instinct is to tell the story of her broken heart. Avery made me understand that the court does not care about my broken heart. The court only cares about the math. "You must stop telling the story through the lens of your feelings," Avery instructed, handing me a fresh legal pad. "From this moment forward, you only speak the language of evidence. You do not tell the judge that your husband was cruel. You tell the judge the specific date, the exact dollar amount, the routing number of the hidden account, the name of the project he billed it to, the person who signed the authorization, and the person who ultimately benefited from the theft." I wrote down every single word she said. I was learning a brand new language, the language of precise, surgical retribution. Before we concluded our meeting, Avery's expression darkened slightly. She offered me a stern, crucial warning. "You need to be prepared for his defense strategy," she said softly. "Men like your husband, men who build their egos on the invisible labor of their wives, share a very predictable playbook when they are cornered. When we present this evidence, he will not confess. He will attack your credibility. He will use your lack of formal education against you. He will stand in front of a judge, with his expensive lawyer by his side, and attempt to smear you. He will call you a confused, emotional housewife who simply does not understand complex corporate finance. He will try to make you look small so that his lies look big." I thought about Grant standing in our kitchen, casually telling me that his fraudulent wire transfer was high-level business I could not possibly understand. I thought about the smug, patronizing smile he wore when he introduced his mistress as a brand consultant. "Let him try," I whispered, closing my notebook. I stood up, shaking Avery's hand. I packed my binders back into my canvas bag. The bag felt incredibly heavy, but I carried it with a completely new posture. I walked out of the Civil Legal Aid Center and stepped into the bright, blinding afternoon sun of the parking lot. I still did not have a fully retained, high-priced attorney to stand beside me in the courtroom. I was still driving a thoroughly practical 10-year-old sedan. To the outside observer, I was still the exact same unremarkable, middle-aged suburban woman I had been that morning. But everything had changed. As I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat, I realized I had left my grief inside that dusty office. I was no longer a discarded wife drowning in the wreckage of a failed marriage. For the very first time since this nightmare began, I possessed a clear, calculated strategy. And as I turned the key in the ignition, feeling the engine rumble to life, I knew with absolute certainty that a quiet woman armed with a strategy is far more dangerous than a woman armed with nothing but her tears. The preliminary injunctions in a standard divorce are theoretically designed to freeze the marital battlefield, ensuring neither party can inflict structural damage before the court makes a ruling. However, Grant was a man who viewed legal boundaries as nothing more than minor inconveniences meant for lesser men. His first offensive maneuver was not physical. It was deeply, strategically logistical. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. I walked out of the front door, my key fob in my hand, prepared to drive to the county library and then to my newly acquired part-time job at a local bakery. It was an exhausting position paying exactly $15 per hour, but it was the only way I could secure untraceable cash to keep my cell phone active and my gas tank full. I stopped dead on the concrete driveway. The space where my silver sport utility vehicle usually sat was completely empty. I had driven that car for 6 years. I used it to haul Maddie to her high school tournaments, to pick up emergency supplies for Grant's job sites, and to keep our household running. Panic flared hot in my chest. I assumed it had been stolen. I reached for my phone to dial the local police department, but my screen illuminated with a sterile, brief text message from Grant. He coldly informed me that the vehicle was legally registered under the corporate umbrella of Cooper Ridge Development, not my personal name. He claimed the company was experiencing a sudden fleet shortage and that he had dispatched one of his site managers to retrieve the asset for urgent project use. He had orchestrated this in the dead of night, slipping onto the property like a thief. It was a masterful stroke of legal cruelty. He knew I lived in the sprawling, manicured suburbs where public transportation simply did not exist. By taking my car, he was taking my legs. He was attempting to sever my access to the bank, to my legal resources, and to my only independent source of income. 3 days later, we faced each other across a wide mahogany table in a neutral beige conference room for our mandatory early mediation session. There were 2 court-appointed mediators present, a man and a woman whose faces carried the exhausted resignation of people who watched marriages die for a living. Grant arrived wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, emanating absolute confidence. I arrived slightly out of breath, having spent $40 I could barely spare on a private rideshare service just to reach the building on time. When the female mediator opened the floor, I calmly raised the issue of the vehicle. I kept my voice entirely level, stating that seizing my only mode of transportation was a punitive retaliatory tactic designed specifically to isolate me and restrict my ability to secure employment. Grant did not even look at the mediators. He turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was flat, hard, and completely devoid of the 2 decades of history we shared. He leaned back comfortably in his heavy leather chair, steepled his manicured fingers together, and spoke in a tone of supreme condescension. He stated that I needed to start learning how to live within my own actual financial means. He argued that since I no longer contributed a measurable income to the household, I did not require the luxury of a fully funded company vehicle. I felt the familiar burning heat of humiliation rise in the back of my throat. But the voice of Avery Sloane echoed loudly in my mind, commanding me to strip the emotion from the room. I did not blink. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact. It was exactly in this moment of tension that Grant made his most arrogant, fatal misstep. The male mediator attempted to gently suggest that removing the wife's primary transportation was highly unusual at this stage. Grant let out a short, dismissive laugh. He shook his head, gestured vaguely toward my scuffed canvas tote bag sitting on the floor, and uttered the sentence that would eventually become the title of his own destruction. "She cannot even afford a decent lawyer," Grant chuckled, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "She is just trying to squeeze the company for assets she never earned." The 2 mediators shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging a rapid, silent glance. A younger version of me would have shattered right there. A weaker woman would have let the tears fall and stormed out of the room in a dramatic display of wounded pride. I did none of those things. I simply unzipped my bag, pulled out my solid black notebook, and clicked my pen. I did not say a single word in my defense. I looked down at the crisp white page and meticulously wrote down the exact time, which was 15 minutes past 10 in the morning. I wrote down the full names of the 2 mediators present in the room. I wrote down the exact context of the conversation, and I transcribed his quote verbatim. I understood, sitting in that sterile room, a fundamental truth about men who build their empires on narcissism. They always dig their own graves with the shovel of their own contempt. He thought his words were a weapon that would finally break my spirit. He did not realize he was actively establishing a documented, witnessed pattern of financial abuse and coercive control. The collateral damage of his arrogance began to bleed into our family life that very weekend. Maddie drove down from Nashville on Friday evening. Having borrowed a compact car from her roommate to make the trip, the atmosphere inside the house was thick and suffocating. Grant stopped by briefly on Saturday morning to pack a few remaining boxes of his expensive shoes and watches. He did not greet our daughter with his usual booming, charismatic warmth. Instead, he stood in the front hallway and began aggressively barking orders at me regarding a piece of misdelivered corporate mail. His tone was sharp, degrading, and entirely stripped of any basic human decency. He spoke to me exactly the way a tyrant speaks to an incompetent, newly fired employee who is taking too much time to vacate the premises. I did not argue back. I did not defend myself. I simply handed him the unopened envelope and stepped aside. I looked up and saw Maddie standing at the top landing of the staircase. Her face was completely drained of color. For her entire 22 years of life, she had believed her father was the ultimate benevolent protector of our family. Watching him verbally discard me in our own hallway, treating me like a nuisance rather than a partner, was the precise moment the grand illusion violently shattered. She did not yell at him. She did not say a single word. She just walked slowly down the wooden stairs, wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, and buried her face in my neck. Her profound silence was the loudest, most devastating condemnation Grant had ever received. At the exact same time his personal life was cracking, his professional facade began to splinter. The most telling fracture happened on my cell phone the following Monday afternoon. 2 different independent contractors called my personal number within 3 hours of each other. One was a master electrician I had coordinated with for 8 solid years, and the other was our primary bulk soil supplier. Both men were incredibly apologetic, speaking in hushed, nervous tones. They wanted to know why their recent payment checks were over 3 weeks late. The electrician sounded frantic. He told me he had called the main Cooper Ridge office 4 separate times, only to be transferred endlessly to a confused new receptionist who had absolutely no idea how to access the vendor ledgers or process an accounts payable request. For nearly 2 decades, when I quietly controlled the internal flow of money, a trusted vendor was never left waiting. The machine ran perfectly because I was the one constantly oiling the gears. I sat alone at my kitchen counter, listening to the supplier complain about the sudden, terrifying administrative chaos swallowing the company. Grant had proudly ousted me, firmly believing I was nothing more than an easily replaceable, uneducated secretary. He assumed his sophisticated new branding consultant and a fresh, modern marketing campaign would automatically propel his business to new heights. He was spectacularly wrong. He had violently ripped out the engine of his own machine without understanding how it actually functioned. Cooper Ridge Development was not stronger without me. It was already beginning to misfire, choking rapidly on its own disorganized weight. I realized then that his company was nothing but a beautiful, hollow shell. It just needed one precise, legally calculated push, and the entire fraudulent structure would collapse under the weight of his incompetence. Grant truly believed that by taking away my transportation, restricting my access to our money, and stripping away my right to speak in my own home, he had won the war. He thought those actions would be enough to make me disappear silently into the background. He was entirely blind to the reality of his situation. He did not know that by aggressively pushing me out of the shadows, he had just cut away the very last layer of camouflage protecting his own crimes. The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse hummed with a low, oppressive frequency. It was 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, and the air inside the corridor smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside the designated courtroom. I was completely alone. Avery Sloan was operating strictly as a consulting attorney behind the scenes, meaning my severely limited budget did not cover her physical presence at this temporary injunction hearing. I was representing myself. I wore a plain navy cardigan, sensible dark slacks, and practical flat shoes. Resting on my lap was a massive, heavy binder. I had spent the last 48 hours tabbing every single page with brightly colored index markers, carefully categorizing 2 decades of my invisible labor. Down the hall, the heavy oak doors swung open. Grant walked in, flanked by his attorney, Darren Pike. Darren was exactly the kind of high-priced litigation lawyer men like my husband hire when they want to crush someone through sheer financial intimidation. Darren wore a bespoke pinstripe suit, a heavy gold watch, and possessed the smooth, practiced posture of a man who won his cases by suffocating the opposition before the judge even hit the wooden gavel. Grant walked closely beside him, his shoulders relaxed, a look of serene, untouchable confidence plastered across his face. When the bailiff called our case, we stepped into the courtroom and took our places at the heavy mahogany tables. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a thoroughly no-nonsense demeanor, peered down from the bench. She had a stack of preliminary filings spread out in front of her. Darren Pike did not waste a single second. As soon as the floor was opened, he launched into a highly polished, aggressive monologue designed to immediately establish a narrative of hierarchy within the room. His voice was smooth and resonant, easily filling the high-ceilinged space. He painted a grand picture of a massively successful, highly complex commercial enterprise entirely envisioned, built, and executed by Grant. When it came time to address me, Darren's tone dropped into a register of faux sympathy. He told the judge that while I was a dedicated mother, I possessed no independent income of note. He heavily emphasized that I held no professional degrees, no certifications in accounting, and absolutely no formal corporate training. Because of these alleged intellectual deficits, Darren aggressively argued that my requests for comprehensive financial discovery were overly burdensome and frankly absurd. He gestured toward me with an open palm, stating to the court that I could hardly interpret complex corporate records, let alone justify demanding access to the internal ledgers. Grant sat quietly next to his lawyer, offering the judge a soft, almost pitying smile. When the judge asked him to clarify my actual role during the marriage, Grant leaned toward his microphone. He used the exact patronizing tone he frequently used when speaking to a subordinate who had asked a foolish question. He stated that I was simply a traditional wife who occasionally helped out with minor household and office chores whenever the professional administrative staff felt overwhelmed. I did not flush with anger. I did not interrupt him to defend my pride. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the cover of my binder, waiting for the air in the room to shift. The judge flipped through the initial summary Avery and I had submitted. She looked over the thick rims of her reading glasses, her expression visibly tightening. She turned her attention away from Darren's smooth theatrical performance and looked directly at Grant. She asked a very simple, practical question. If I was merely performing minor household chores, she wanted to know who precisely was in charge of approving the weekly payroll for the 50-plus subcontractors operating on their commercial sites. Darren opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised her hand, silencing the lawyer instantly. She wanted the answer directly from Grant. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his heavy leather chair. The serene confidence on his face flickered, disappearing for a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat and vaguely muttered that the company utilized an external payroll service and various rotating administrative assistants over the years. The judge did not let up. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the quiet room. She asked who maintained the critical certificates of liability insurance for the multi-million-dollar municipal bids. She asked who served as the primary day-to-day liaison for the external certified public accountant during the rigorous quarterly tax reviews. For the first time since he swaggered into the building, Darren Pike looked genuinely uncertain. He glanced sideways at Grant. Grant looked down at the table, suddenly entirely unable to produce a single verifiable name to answer her questions. The silence in the courtroom stretched out, thick, heavy, and incredibly revealing. The judge turned her gaze to me. I unclasped the metal rings of my binder. I did not deliver a passionate, tearful speech about my unappreciated sacrifices. I did not let my voice waver. Every single sentence I spoke was brief, entirely factual, and directly anchored to the paper sitting in front of me. I directed the judge to the yellow tab. I stated that I had personally calculated and approved every single payroll cycle for the last 19 years. I directed her to the blue tab. I stated that the external certified public accountant only corresponded with my personal email address regarding the quarterly reconciliations. I directed her to the red tab, which contained over 200 pages of vendor dispute resolutions, all bearing my specific digital signature. The atmosphere in the room fundamentally altered. The sheer, overwhelming volume of my documentation, combined with my absolute lack of emotional theatrics, stripped away Darren's carefully constructed narrative piece by piece. I was not asking the judge to believe my feelings. I was handing her the structural blueprints of the company. Sensing the rapid shift in power, Darren Pike scrambled to regain control of the room. He stood up abruptly, attempting to physically dominate the space by raising his voice. He objected to my characterization of the documents. He leaned heavily on his original, condescending defense, loudly proclaiming that without formal training or a college degree in forensic accounting, I lacked the fundamental capacity to accurately categorize these expenditures. He argued that I was wildly misinterpreting standard corporate tax strategies due to my lack of official education. I closed my binder with a sharp, decisive snap. I looked past Darren and locked eyes directly with Grant. Then, I turned my face back to the bench. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the very back row of the empty gallery. I stated calmly that I did not need a master's degree in finance to recognize which specific transactions were intentionally fabricated to hide marital assets. Darren's jaw clenched tight. Grant's head snapped up. The phrase regarding hidden marital assets was no longer a vague accusation whispered in the confines of a kitchen. It was now a formal recorded statement echoing across a court of law. The judge stared at Darren for a long, profoundly uncomfortable moment. She did not issue a final ruling on the division of the estate that day, as this was strictly a preliminary hearing. But her subsequent actions made it abundantly clear that the weather in the room had permanently changed. She visibly expressed her profound annoyance at the defense's blatant, insulting attempt to minimize my actual operational role. She immediately struck down Darren's motion to limit the scope of my discovery. Instead, she ordered Grant to produce every single unredacted financial ledger, bank statement, and property deed requested in my filing within 14 days. Furthermore, she issued a stern, pointed warning regarding the severe legal penalties for perjury and the intentional concealment of assets during a dissolution of marriage. The wooden gavel fell, officially dismissing the hearing. I packed my binder back into my canvas tote bag. I stood up and pushed my chair in. Across the aisle, Darren was sharply whispering into Grant's ear, his previously smooth demeanor completely replaced by aggressive, rapid hand gestures and a deeply flushed face. I walked down the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors. Grant stepped out of his row at the exact same time. For a brief second, we were standing just 3 feet apart in the quiet aisle. I looked directly at him, fully expecting the familiar sneer, the arrogant chuckle, or another patronizing remark about my lack of funds, but it never came. Grant stopped walking completely. He turned his head away from me and stared rigidly at the scuffed marble floor. He stood perfectly still, waiting for me to pass him by. For the very first time in 20 years, the man who had built his entire identity on demanding the attention of every room he entered absolutely refused to look me in the eye. It was not the ultimate victory. I still did not have my vehicle, and I was still scraping by on $15 an hour just to survive the month. But as I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the hallway, I felt a quiet, powerful surge of triumph settling deep into my bones. Grant had walked into that room fully expecting to effortlessly swat away a minor nuisance. Instead, he realized he had just locked himself inside a cage with a quiet, patient, meticulously prepared adversary. He finally understood that I was no longer the obedient wife standing with her head bowed in the kitchen, and that realization terrified him far more than any temporary legal sanction ever could. The structural integrity of a massive lie rarely fails because of a single, heroic strike from the outside. Usually, it collapses from the inside, brought down by the sheer, exhausting weight of maintaining the fiction. For Grant, the fatal breach did not come from a private investigator or a forensic accountant. It came from a highly competent, severely overworked litigation assistant named Leah Pike. Leah was the sister-in-law and right hand of Darren Pike. For 15 years, she had managed the chaotic administrative flow of his prestigious law firm. She was the one who actually read the hundreds of pages of financial addendums before Darren confidently presented them in court. Late one Tuesday evening, while preparing the final mandatory disclosure packets for our upcoming status conference, Leah was cross-referencing Grant's newly sworn statement of net worth against the firm's archived files. Darren had previously represented Cooper Ridge Development in a commercial contract dispute roughly 3 years prior, and Leah had pulled the old corporate valuation files to ensure their current narrative remained consistent. It was not consistent. While reviewing an old performance bond application from that previous case, Leah noticed a glaring discrepancy. 3 years ago, Grant had declared a massive equipment fleet and a highly lucrative, unencumbered operational cash reserve to secure a municipal contract. In the current divorce filings, under the exact same corporate entity, those specific heavy assets and liquid reserves had magically evaporated, replaced by highly leveraged debt and depreciated values. The numbers were off by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Leah did not intend to become a whistleblower. She was fiercely loyal to her firm and had no desire to violate attorney-client privilege. She simply assumed Grant had provided them with the wrong spreadsheet, a sloppy error that needed immediate internal correction before they submitted the final draft to the judge. Working on her fourth cup of coffee just past midnight, Leah quickly drafted a memorandum highlighting the massive financial contradictions. She attached both the old, robust valuation and the new, anemic disclosure, requesting immediate clarification. In her exhausted state, her finger slipped on the keyboard. Instead of routing the email to Darren's private internal inbox, the autofill feature populated the address bar with the email of the county clerk's public electronic filing system, an address she had been using all day to submit routine motions. She hit send, permanently and officially logging a document titled Discrepancy in Cooper Net Worth Affidavit into the open public record of our divorce proceedings. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Avery Sloan was already reviewing the county docket over her morning tea. Avery might have been operating out of a cramped, budget-friendly legal aid office, but her eyes were sharper than any high-priced corporate litigator in the city. She saw the misfiled document the moment the system refreshed. My phone rang while I was wiping down the display cases at the bakery. Avery did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was tight with adrenaline. She told me to step outside into the alley immediately. Avery explained the procedural miracle that had just occurred. Because Leah had accidentally submitted the internal memo to the public docket, the discrepancy was no longer a protected secret. It was a matter of public record. The heavy ironclad vault Grant and Darren had built around his finances had just been accidentally left wide open. Avery worked furiously, drafting an emergency supplemental motion. She attached the clerk's automated receipt of Leah's email, formally demanding that the court compel Grant to explain why he had sworn under oath that his company was nearly bankrupt when, just 36 months prior, he had sworn to a commercial bonding agency that it was swimming in capital. The dominoes were finally beginning to fall, and the second one was pushed over by the person Grant was most certain he completely controlled. Maddie called me on a Thursday evening. She was sitting in her small, off-campus apartment in Nashville. For weeks, she had been quiet, observing the escalating hostility from a safe distance, processing the sudden, violent death of her father's pristine image. But Maddie was no longer a sheltered child. She was a brilliant, highly capable adult who had inherited my meticulous attention to detail. She asked me if I remembered her old university email address, the one she had used during her freshman year before switching to a private server. I told her I did. Her voice dropped to a low, furious whisper. She explained that she had logged into that old, dormant account to retrieve an archived syllabus for a graduate application. When she opened the inbox, she found dozens of automated security emails from a major regional bank. They were two-factor authentication codes, Grant had needed a clean, untraceable digital location to receive the security pins for the secret bank accounts tied to Vail Harbor Holdings. He knew I monitored our home network, his primary business email, and the physical mail. In his supreme arrogance, he assumed his daughter would never check a defunct college inbox. He had used Maddie's digital identity as the security backbone for his financial fraud, pulling her unknowingly into his web of deceit to shield himself from liability. Maddie did not cry. She did not call him to demand an explanation or play the role of the wounded victim. She took screenshots of every single banking timestamp, downloaded the entire archive of access logs, and forwarded the massive file directly to my current inbox. She understood the assignment perfectly. She knew her father had crossed a line from which there was no return, and she chose her side without a single moment of hesitation. I forwarded the digital logs to Avery. The narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer just a case of an arrogant husband moving money to lower his alimony exposure. This was a calculated, premeditated manipulation of electronic verification flows. Grant had actively engineered a fraudulent digital paper trail, bypassing his own credentials and exploiting his family members to ensure his stolen wealth could never be traced directly back to his phone. The rising heat of the impending legal firestorm did not go unnoticed by the woman for whom he had stolen the money. Sienna Vale was a woman who traded strictly on aesthetics and upward mobility. She had signed up for the role of the glamorous partner to a wealthy, successful real estate developer. She had absolutely no interest in becoming a named accomplice in a sprawling, multi-tiered forensic accounting investigation. The week after Avery filed the supplemental motion regarding the financial discrepancies and the manipulated digital logs, the atmosphere around Grant drastically changed. Sienna simply vanished. The expensive, cloying perfume disappeared from the interior of his truck. The artisanal coffee cups were no longer left on the office desks. She completely stopped attending the regional zoning board meetings where she had previously paraded as his brilliant new brand consultant. Like a rat sensing the structural vibrations of a sinking ship, she quietly packed her silk blouses and severed her ties, leaving Grant entirely alone to face the catastrophic consequences of his own hubris. The sheer terror of his isolation finally broke him. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week before we were scheduled to face the judge for a massive evidentiary hearing. My phone buzzed. It was a text message from Grant. He did not use his attorney. He did not use formal mediation channels. He asked if I would meet him at a quiet, neutral coffee shop on the edge of town. I walked into the cafe wearing my usual practical sweater. Grant was sitting in a corner booth. The flawless, custom-tailored confidence was completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his ceramic mug. He did not attempt to gaslight me. He did not raise his voice or call me an uneducated housewife. He looked around the empty cafe, leaned across the small wooden table, and offered me a private settlement. His voice was hurried and desperate. He promised to give me the house free and clear. He offered a massive lump sum cash payout, more money than I had ever seen in our primary checking account. He promised to cover the remainder of Maddie's graduate tuition in full and provide a generous, permanent alimony structure. He laid out a golden parachute, a life of absolute financial security and comfort. He only asked for one thing in return. I had to instruct Avery to immediately withdraw the supplemental discovery motions. I had to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding Vail Harbor Holdings, and I had to allow him to seal the corporate financial records permanently from the public court docket. I sat back in the wooden booth, looking at the man I had served for 20 years. I watched his chest rise and fall with shallow, frantic breaths. A profound, icy calm settled over my entire body. I did not feel the urge to accept his money, nor did I feel the need to hurl insults at him. I looked at his desperate, pleading eyes, and a chilling realization washed over me. For months, he had laughed in my face. He had openly mocked my intelligence, stripped away my vehicle, and loudly proclaimed to a room full of professionals that I was too poor and too stupid to fight him. But sitting in that quiet cafe, watching him frantically try to buy my silence, I understood the absolute truth of our new reality. When a man who previously found your destruction amusing suddenly begs to negotiate in the dark, it means he has finally looked down and seen the terrifying, bottomless abyss opening up right beneath his own feet. Avery Sloane called me on a Tuesday afternoon. We had the evidence securely locked in her filing cabinet, but the reality of the legal system is rarely as swift or glamorous as people imagine. It is a slow, grinding machine designed to test your endurance. Avery was completely honest with me. She explained that we had amassed more than enough structural proof to inflict catastrophic financial damage on Grant. We could force a forensic audit, drag his entire operation through the mud, and expose the fraudulent holding company to the Internal Revenue authorities. But she also warned me about the agonizing toll of a protracted trial. The further we pushed, the more exhausting it would become. The court dates would drag out for months, draining my spirit, my energy, and the very little money I had managed to scrape together from my part-time job. Sensing this exact vulnerability, Grant's legal team sent over a formal settlement offer. It was incredibly strategic. It was an out-of-court arrangement designed to make the problem simply disappear in the dark. The terms were undeniably tempting for a woman currently living out of a suitcase. He offered a lump sum of $250,000 in untaxed cash, the deed to a very comfortable, fully paid condominium in a secure neighborhood, and 24 months of guaranteed transitional spousal support. For many people, this would represent the ultimate victory. It was a golden parachute, an opportunity to sign a piece of paper, walk away from the wreckage of a 20-year marriage, and never have to look at the man who betrayed them ever again. All he required in exchange was my signature on an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a voluntary dismissal of my requests for a full business valuation. I stood alone in the cramped kitchen of my temporary month-to-month rental apartment. The walls were thin, and the refrigerator emitted a constant, rattling hum. Around my feet sat 6 unopened cardboard boxes, containing the meager remnants of my previous life. I held the thick, legally binding settlement contract in my hands, staring at the perfectly typed clauses. A deep, insidious doubt began to creep into my mind. I wondered if I was losing my perspective. I asked myself if I had crossed the line from seeking basic fairness into harboring an unhealthy, consuming obsession. My body was bone-tired. My bank account was dangerously close to zero. The thought of sleeping in a stable, paid off home with $250,000 in the bank, was a heavy temptation pulling at my exhausted muscles. But then I looked past the contract and stared at the blank wall of the kitchen. I did not see the peeling paint. I saw the last 2 decades of my existence. I remembered the countless evenings spent hunched over a glowing computer screen at midnight, untangling tax codes I had taught myself to read. I remembered the incredibly specific tone of voice Grant used when he told me I simply did not understand high-level business. I remembered the sheer volume of frantic phone calls from heavy machinery operators and concrete suppliers, men who bypassed the mighty company founder entirely and called my personal cell phone because they knew I was the only person who actually possessed the answers. They trusted my word, not his. I had been the invisible gravity holding his entire universe together, and his settlement offer was simply a bribe to ensure I remained invisible forever. Maddie came over to the apartment that evening, bringing a pair of cheap takeout pizzas. She found me sitting at the small, wobbly dining table, the settlement papers spread out under the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb. She set the food down, pulled up a chair, and read through the executive summary of the offer. She did not tell me what to do. She did not act like a child caught between 2 warring parents. She looked at me with the sharp, clear-eyed wisdom of a young woman who had just watched the grand illusion of her family violently shatter. Maddie pushed the contract back toward me and delivered the sentence that ultimately decided the entire trajectory of my life. She said that if I stopped fighting right now simply because my bones were tired, he would spend the rest of his natural life walking around the country club, telling every single person he met that he generously took care of his poor, uneducated ex-wife. She told me that he would use this settlement to paint himself as a martyr, but if I kept going, if I pushed through the exhaustion and stepped into that courtroom, the public record would permanently speak the truth for me. Her words cut through the fog of my fatigue like a scalpel. I realized then that accepting his hush money was not a victory. It was just a different form of surrender. I reached for my phone and dialed Avery's number. I told her I was officially rejecting the confidential settlement. My decision was not rooted in a petty, melodramatic desire to utterly destroy the man I once loved. It was rooted in a profound, unshakable refusal to build the entire second half of my life on top of another one of his fabricated narratives. I deserved to have my labor acknowledged in the harsh light of day. When Avery heard the absolute resolve in my voice, a distinct shift occurred on her end of the line. Up until that point, she had only been advising me on a limited consulting basis because I could not afford her full trial retainer. But Avery was a woman who understood the deeply entrenched systemic inequalities of marital asset division. She recognized that my fight was no longer just about splitting bank accounts. Avery formally agreed to step in as my primary attorney of record for the final, deciding trial. She drastically reduced her immediate fee to an absolute minimum, a sum I could barely cover by draining my small emergency savings account. She agreed to defer the massive remainder of her bill, making it entirely contingent upon the judge ordering Grant to pay my legal costs. She did this because she believed the implications of our evidence carried a value far greater than a standard hourly billing rate. She wanted to force the legal system to firmly look at the unpaid, unrecognized, and heavily exploited labor that countless spouses pour into the foundations of supposedly self-made men. The evening before the final court date arrived, the atmosphere in my small apartment was entirely devoid of the dramatic tension you might expect before a life-altering battle. I did not open a bottle of cheap wine to numb my nerves. I did not sit on the edge of the mattress and cry over old wedding photographs. I did not harbor a single urge to pick up the phone and beg Grant to simply stop the madness and return to the way things used to be. The woman who would have done those things had died months ago, buried underneath a mountain of highlighted bank statements. Instead, I cleared the small dining table. I took out my heavy binders and my solid black notebook. I methodically arranged every single piece of paper into perfect chronological order. I verified the color-coded index tabs, marking the fraudulent wire transfers, the hidden property deeds, and the manipulated digital login logs. I wrote out a clear, concise list of cross-examination questions for Avery. I packed everything neatly into my canvas tote bag, ensuring the zippers were secure. Then, I turned off the lights, got into bed, and experienced the most profound, deeply restful 8 hours of sleep I had known in over a year. When the sun rose the following morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. I put on a simple, well-pressed suit. I drank a single cup of black coffee. As I walked out of the apartment and drove toward the downtown courthouse, I felt a heavy, magnificent armor settle onto my shoulders. I was not walking into that majestic building to beg a judge for mercy, nor was I going to plead for a fair share of charity. I was walking into the room to finalize a comprehensive inventory of the truth, and no amount of money in the world could buy my silence anymore. The heavy double doors of the county courthouse sealed shut behind us, cutting off the ambient noise of the hallway and locking us inside the high-ceilinged room where the final disposition of my life would be decided. The air was incredibly stale, smelling of polished wood and nervous anticipation. I sat beside Avery Sloan at the petitioner's table. Across the center aisle sat Grant, clad in his signature custom-tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of completely unbothered superiority. Beside him, Darren Pike arranged his thick stacks of defense files with aggressive, performative confidence. Presiding over the chamber was Judge Elena Marrow. She was a woman who possessed a remarkably severe posture and a gaze that seemed to cut right through the polished mahogany of the bench. Darren did not waste a single second when the proceedings began. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and launched into his opening statement. He immediately attempted to steer the narrative back to his most comfortable, heavily rehearsed territory, my supposed intellectual inferiority. His voice echoed across the quiet room, dripping with a smooth, calculated condescension. He emphasized repeatedly that I possessed absolutely no formal corporate training and no professional degrees in finance. He painted a picture of a confused, deeply emotional spouse who was wildly overstepping her boundaries. He gestured vaguely in my direction with a heavy gold pen, telling the judge that my entire financial argument was merely the result of an uneducated woman improperly extrapolating malicious intent from her basic domestic support duties. He insisted that the complex structural maneuvers Grant executed were standard operating procedures for high-level real estate development, completely beyond my capacity to accurately interpret. It was exactly at that moment, while his lawyer was speaking, that Grant leaned forward in his leather chair. He let out a sharp, derisive scoff. He looked over at me, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face, and spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry perfectly up to the bench. "Your Honor, she cannot even afford the kind of lawyer that handles a case like this." A sudden, suffocating silence slammed down on the entire courtroom. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. Darren flinched, his smooth opening argument dying instantly in his throat. I did not turn my head, I did not blink, and I certainly did not flush with embarrassment. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, my hands resting perfectly still on top of my organized binders. I knew better than to react. I knew that the most arrogant, narcissistic men in the world do not need an opponent to destroy them. If you simply give them enough quiet space, they will enthusiastically press the detonator themselves. Judge Elena Marrow slowly lowered her pen. She picked up the thick evidentiary file Avery had submitted the previous week, the one containing every single page of my meticulous late-night bookkeeping. The judge flipped a single page, the sound incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the room. She adjusted her reading glasses, looked down from the bench, and fixed her sharp eyes directly on Grant. "Mr. Cooper," Judge Marrow said, her voice dropping into a slow, dangerously quiet register that commanded absolute authority. "Based on what I have reviewed in these preliminary filings, Mrs. Cooper does not appear to be the least informed person in this room. She appears to be the only one who understands how your business actually functioned." The atmosphere in the room violently inverted. Darren physically took a half-step backward, completely losing his momentum. Grant's cruel smile vanished instantly, wiped away by a sudden, jarring shock. His posture collapsed. The impeccable, untouchable businessman facade shattered into a million pieces right there in the chair. For the very first time in our 20 years together, I looked at my husband and saw raw, unadulterated terror radiating from his eyes. He had assumed the judge would side with the man wearing the expensive watch. He had never anticipated a courtroom where the paper trail spoke louder than his charisma. Avery Sloane stood up. She did not raise her voice or engage in theatrical pacing. She simply walked the court through the absolute, irrefutable math of Grant's betrayal. Step by methodical step, she laid out the devastating chain of evidence. She presented the incorporation documents for the hidden limited liability company. She traced the disguised, broken-down wire transfers of $38,000, $15,000, and $12,000 out of the legitimate corporate accounts. She submitted the digital security logs, proving Grant had actively manipulated two-factor electronic authentication, using his own daughter's dormant university email address to hide his tracks. She exposed the dishonest, intentionally depreciated corporate valuation he had sworn to under oath, contrasting it directly against the robust, highly capitalized financial statements he had previously submitted for commercial bonding. Finally, she clearly demonstrated his blatant commingling of personal and business funds. Darren attempted to object, scrambling to protect his client, but he had absolutely no factual foundation to stand on. When Grant was finally called to the witness stand and questioned directly about Vail Harbor Holdings, the confident orator completely disappeared. He stuttered. He deflected. He offered vague, nonsensical answers about temporary tax shelters and exploratory real estate holding vessels. He looked incredibly small, shrinking under the harsh fluorescent lights as his own lies trapped him in a corner. Then, I was called to the stand. I did not cry. I did not speak about the betrayal of my marriage or the younger woman he had paraded through my kitchen. When Avery asked me to explain the internal operations of Cooper Ridge Development, I answered with cold, surgical precision. I detailed the exact routing processes for vendor payments. I explained the specific internal coding mechanisms used to authorize heavy machinery rentals. Every single sentence I spoke synchronized perfectly, flawlessly, with the hundreds of pages of physical documentation already entered into evidence. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the central nervous system of his entire operation. After 2 grueling hours of testimony, Judge Marrow had heard enough. She delivered her ruling from the bench with zero hesitation. She stated for the official record that Grant Cooper had engaged in a deliberate, premeditated scheme to intentionally conceal marital assets and defraud the court. She immediately ordered a massive, independent forensic revaluation of the entire business entity. She ruled that the hidden lakefront warehouse property and all liquid funds tied to the shell company were to be immediately absorbed back into the marital estate. Because of his blatant financial perjury, she applied severe punitive sanctions against his share of the eventual division. Then came the final, devastating blow to his ego. Because Grant had intentionally attempted to financially starve me out of the legal process, the judge ordered him to pay the vast majority of my legal fees, effectively forcing him to fund the very sword that had just cut his empire to the ground. But as I sat there listening to the final gavel strike the heavy wooden block, I realized the true climax of my victory had absolutely nothing to do with the financial settlement. The money was necessary for my survival, but it was not the prize. The ultimate victory was the permanent, irreversible destruction of his narrative. Before a judge, court reporters, and the public record, the court officially recognized that I had served as the essential, operational backbone of the company for nearly 2 decades. Every single effort Grant had made to reduce me to a clueless, easily discarded housewife had collapsed into dust. He could never again walk into a country club and claim he built his success entirely alone. The legal system had finally recognized my invisible labor. I packed my empty binders into my canvas bag one final time. I did not walk out of the courtroom doors like a dramatic, vindicated queen in a fairy tale revenge movie. I did not offer Grant a smug parting remark. I simply walked out of the heavy double doors and stepped into the bright, afternoon sunlight of the city street. I walked away as a woman whose name had finally, undeniably been written into the truth. For a man whose entire existence was built on an illusion, my undeniable reality was the one thing that destroyed him far more thoroughly than any financial judgment ever could. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.